Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Wald, the Director of External Affairs for CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Today, we'll discuss ways to strengthen technical capabilities related to national security through a proposed national research cloud and other tools. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat function for anything else just yet. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator. Dr. Jeffrey Ding is a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. He received his PhD in international relations from the University of Oxford, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. His research interests include the effects of technological revolutions on the rise and fall of great powers, US-China competition over strategic technologies, and assessments of national scientific and technological capabilities. Dr. Ding has also worked as a researcher for CSET and for Oxford's Center for the Governance of AI. Jeff, over to you.
Thanks, Lynn, and thank you for coordinating this really wonderful program. I'm excited to introduce our two main speakers. First is Andrew Lohn. He's a senior fellow at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where he works on the Cyber AI project. Prior to CSET, he was an information scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he led research also on cybersecurity and AI issues. Prior to RAND, he also worked at Sandia National Labs, NASA, Hewlett-Packard Labs, and a few startups, and he's published widely, including MIT Tech Review, Foreign Policy, BBC, and Gizmodo. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from UC Santa Cruz and a bachelor's in engineering from McMaster University. And second is Russell Wald, who will lead us off today in our presentations. He's the Director of Policy for Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And he's led a team that advances that institute's engagement with government and civil society organizations to benefit the world in terms of human-centered uses of AI. And he's also co-authored the Building a National AI Research Resource, a blueprint for the National Research Cloud, which is the study that he'll be presenting on today. Previously led government relations on behalf of Stanford University's Hoover Institution as well, and also worked at Stanford Cyber Policy Center. He's a graduate of UCLA. And just one more reminder that please hold your questions in the chat until we're done with both presentations. And if we get really good engaging questions, I have permission from the higher ups to even go a little bit over time. So please do contribute your questions once the presentations are over. I'll turn it over to you, Russell. Thanks for being here.
Okay, so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes discussing the concept of a national research cloud and how we arrived at this point. I'll start with a brief overview and provide our theory of the case as to why we believe not only US academics would benefit from such an infrastructure, but downstream effects could positively impact the economy and solidify national security. So in late 2019, HAI co-directors Fei-Fei Li and John Etchemendy recognized a growing imbalance in AI research with a greater tilt towards commercialization and less on basic scientific research. As I'll explain later, a primary reason for this is the lack of resources available to academic researchers compared to industry. Stanford HAI's core mission is to promote human-centered AI, which fundamentally requires broadening who has access, input, and oversight of AI resources. And so to this challenge, Fei-Fei and Etchemendy proposed the concept of having the federal government architect a cloud utilizing government-held data sets and making them available to nonprofit researchers, what they called the National Research Cloud. In early 2020, Fei-Fei and Etchemendy began to socialize the concept with various groups, including computer science universities. In March of 2020, 22 presidents and provosts of the top 30 computer science universities proposed in an open letter to Congress and the president a federal task force to study the concept of a national research cloud. Shortly after the call for the task force, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence endorsed the concept of the cloud in their first set of recommendations, to which they noted the aforementioned imbalance in the AI innovation ecosystem. and how it threatens to stagnate US economic and technological competitiveness. This led to the drafting of the National AI Research Resource Task Force Act of 2020, legislation that passed last year. A federal task force has now been established with representatives from academia, civil society, government, and industry. This task force will determine the best pathway forward to a research cloud, with a final report delivered to the Congress and President in the fall of 2022. The federal government has named this the National AI Research Resource, or the NAIR, DC's always favorite acronyms. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll be referring it to the NAIR going forward, just so it's easier to follow instead of the National Research Cloud. After the NAIR task force was announced, my colleagues at HAI created a lab course in the law school to see how the US could indeed architect a cloud and data commons similar to the mission of the task force. This brought brilliant graduate students from law, engineering, computer science, and economics to examine this from a cross-disciplinary perspective. Ultimately, we published a comprehensive study, the most comprehensive study to date of an NAIR. And that will be put in the chat box for anyone who would like to read that report. To start with the theory of the case as to why the NAIR is recommended, we need to understand that there are inherent differences between academic research and commercialized research. With longer time horizons and no profit constraints, basic scientific research has given way to breakthroughs such as GPS and the internet and CRISPR. Examples such as this have led to eventual commercialization of these discoveries and greater downstream benefits to society. If indeed there is an imbalance occurring to the AI innovation ecosystem, AI research will disproportionately focus on short-term commercial applications without ensuring the long-term innovation across the fields. Historically, the US innovation ecosystem has been anchored by partnership between government, universities, and industry. In AI, for example, according to a recent study, approximately 82% of the algorithms used today originated from nonprofit groups and universities supported by government spending, meaning firms using AI today have been supported in their work through the US innovation ecosystem. The data show the downstream effects of the federal government supporting basic science research is substantial, leading to economic boons. For example, after Landsat data became free and open for use in 2008, the count of academic publications rose dramatically, quadrupling between 2005 and 2017. Landsat data led to substantial productivity savings, resulting in an economic benefit of $3.4 billion to the US in 2017 alone. Finally, studies show investing in proficient STEM workforce increases productivity as well. There are two primary drivers in AI innovation that are increasingly growing out of reach for nonprofit researchers: access to compute power and data sets. Many current advances in AI are fueled by large-scale models, which are costly to train and fairly prohibitive relative to the size of a typical academic budget. This is also compounded in large part by the federal underinvestment in basic scientific research. Steadily over the last few decades, the federal government has substantially reduced federal funding of scientific research. And while there has been a recent uptick in legislation to increase federal spending in these fields, it pales in comparison to industry. You'll note on this slide that the fiscal year budget for non-defense AI R&D announced by the White House was $973 million. And that same year, in contrast, the combined spending on R&D in 2018 by 5 major technology platform companies was $80 billion. This lack of infrastructure and funding has led to what we believe is an increasing academic brain drain in AI. In 2011, AI PhDs were roughly likely to go into industry versus academia. 10 years later, 2/3 of AI PhDs go to industry and less than a quarter go into academia. These trends indicate many university researchers struggle to engage in cutting-edge science, draining the field of a diverse set of voices in research. In closing, the risk of exclusively held private AI research is significant, and where at all possible, and we are at a possible inflection point. that is reminiscent of the race to sequence the human genome, where public investment into the Human Genome Project preempted concerns about private firm patenting of the human genome. If designed appropriately, a national research cloud stands to democratize access to the tools needed for AI innovation, particularly in underrepresented groups such as people of color, HBCUs, and rural America, an increase in public science, educating students and increasing the AI talent workforce. And all this stands the potential to unleash a string of advancements in AI. Most importantly, for this conversation, it ensures the US will remain a global leader in AI. And with that, I'll turn it over to Drew.
Thanks, Russell. That was a great introduction. As what Russell laid out there was this task force that was spun up for the NAIR, and they requested information from an open call. We at CSET were one of the people that responded as well. Dakota Carey has a paper that I believe we'll link in the chat that you can go and look at for all of the recommendations that we gave out specifically. Rather than go through each one of those in detail at this point, though, I'd like to step back for a second and kind of talk about how we got to where we are, what this AI boom over the last 10 years has been, and where it might go in the future, and why I think that it needs a little bit of help to keep this progress going. And so the way that we can think about it is there are four main drivers that drive the progress of artificial intelligence. And there's data is one of them, talent, algorithms, and computing. Data people talk about as what really triggered this most recent AI boom. Back in 2012, there was ImageNet that had millions of tagged images that were labeled so that you could do training on it, so that you knew what the image was and what it was, and in words, what it was supposed to be of. And that allowed us to grow bigger and bigger computers and models. At the same time, there's been a deluge of data that there are all kinds of crazy statistics about how much content is generated per second, per day, per year. But not just the data was the issue. We've got the other three characteristics. Algorithms was a really important and interesting one over the same period. What happened is a shift driven by the internet and an open culture within the AI community. And this open culture made it so that not only were researchers writing papers and putting those up online, they were also putting their code up online so that anybody could just download that code, get up to the state of the art immediately and add to it. So people were able to add and adapt and build these algorithms out at a rapid pace. That culture extended all the way into companies. And so major companies like, for instance, Google and Facebook had invested tons in developing their own algorithms and tools for AI, for data processing. All of these things that they provided open source, or at least many of them were open source. So not only do you have the top algorithms provided openly, but you have the tools for running those algorithms presented openly, and they can be built upon. What that also enabled was rapid learning and talent development. And so someone who wanted to learn about how to do AI things was able to follow on an online course or a blog, and they were able to use the state-of-the-art tools. And lastly, compute was one of the trickier ones that was a little bit surprising, because during this period, we were running into the limits of our conventional chip processing. We've been getting smaller and faster and more energy efficient chips for decades, and that slowed down over this period. But what happened at the same time was we got better at parallelization. So even though the chips themselves were not increasing in speed as much as they had been in the past, we were able to use more of them, and that actually generated a big spike in the amount of computing available. Okay, so that is from about 2012 to basically present day. But in the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a shift happening. The best example that I can think of to illustrate this shift is GPT-2. And GPT-2 was released in 2018, about 3 years ago, and it's a language model. But as a language model, it doesn't do just one specific thing. It's capable of doing a wide variety of things. It can do translation. It can read a passage and summarize that text. It can read things and tell you whether it's happy or sad or angry or violent, and it's able to do like rudimentary programming. It's a much broader range of tasks that it's able to do, even though it's a single model. Now it took a ton of data to train that, but you can also take that model once it's been trained, and you can use a much smaller amount of data and repurpose it for your task, as long as it's related to language or something close to it. That model in 2018 was huge. By current standards, not so big, but they released 4 of them, 4 different sizes. And at the time it was held privately, but it quickly became available. They've distributed it now, and now with a few lines of code, I can download it, train it with repurpose it with some smallish data set, and run it for my own purposes. That's not hard to do, but the largest, it's not hard to do for the 3 smaller ones. The larger one crashes the type of GPUs, the AI processors that I like to use for my prototyping. Now, there are bigger AI processors that can handle it, but it's so big that it starts to push the boundary. And that's 3 years ago, which is an eternity in artificial intelligence, of course. Now, the biggest models are hundreds and thousands of times bigger than GPT-2, and there are no processors that are being made that can even come close to handling even like smallish, out-of-date language models of its type. And so that leads us to today, where we're trying to continue this progress, but we're running into several types of barriers. Now, we'll go into the same types of things: the data, the talent, algorithms, and compute. Now, algorithms, we used to think of mostly as the math that would go behind these AI models, but increasingly, the thing that we need access to if we're trying to build out is one of these big trained models, like a GPT-2 or a GPT-3. And so once you have access to that, you can build out from it. But most people don't have access to enough processors to run these models. And the other major problem is that the companies are keeping them proprietary to recover their costs. So they're not even available, even if you could run them. Okay. And so because of those things, the talent is not being developed. No longer is it so easy for someone who just has the ambition and interest to go and grab the current state of the art in models and start building and playing. They're not getting used to those models and those techniques. And they're also not learning the skills that are going to be one of the main factors for the next generation in AI progress, which is parallelization. How do you split up these models across all of these processors? That's an important skill that's not being developed as much in academia or just openly around the world. It's being contained largely within these companies that have the budgets to build and maintain these large models. And then the compute. So this is a big challenge, because the amount of compute has been, as I talked about, has been spiking up from Moore's law. So even though we were going fast before, we're going much faster now. We just released a report yesterday that talks about how far can this compute scaling go before we start to run into major issues. And where we are right now is that the biggest models cost millions of dollars to train, but they cost not very much to repurpose. You just have to have access to many processors at the same time. Now, if this trend continues as it has been going, then we'll be into the realm within a couple years of maybe $1 billion model. Now, where we are now, millions of dollars to train a model sounds like a big number, but it depends on what you compare it to. And if we're talking about large scale investments, like national investments in experimental progress or even scientific experiments, but we have several that get into the billions there, like the National Ignition Facility or like the Large Hadron Collider, things like that. And so our biggest AI models are not even close to the scale of those yet. They may become that in the near future, we'll see. But to use these models costs a lot less money than to develop them. The problem is that we don't have access to those. Now, in addition to costing less money, to use these models, we can get away with much smaller data sets. We don't need these massive data sets necessarily that you need to do the training on. And so that gives a big opportunity for the federal government to provide these types of data sets. On one hand, we want massive data sets to build these models originally, but lots of the applications don't require that huge starting data set. We can use smaller data sets, and that would give an opportunity to shift the direction of the research that's being done and the explorations and the entrepreneurial efforts towards socially beneficial problems that the federal government might benefit from, rather than just whatever industry is going to use to maximize their profits. And so because of the way that the compute growth has changed artificial intelligence, what we need from algorithms has changed and is not as easily accessible as it once was, but could become accessible with a little bit of help from a national AI resource. What we need from computing also has changed and is difficult to access, both for big academic labs that would like to compete with industry to provide these core models that and not hide them behind paywalls, and to develop the talent for building those large models. Also, we need a little bit more compute for maybe undergrad students or would-be entrepreneurs to experiment and learn how to use the techniques that are going to be needed to run these models, let alone build them. And the data that we can provide can help steer us into better directions. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell, Andrew, for those great presentations. I really like how you both mapped out the general landscape for us, contextualized the NAIR within all these different drivers of AI progress, and especially how both of those presentations sort of connected the impact of the NAIR to larger questions of like workforce development and sort of the broader impact on the talent ecosystem as well. I think that's a really important point to draw out. So please, as we get more questions into the chat, let me just start off with a question to both of you. We've seen some pushback to proposals of like the NAIR in terms of how it could entrench sort of large companies, whether that's through the initial cloud credits cloud computing credits maybe being provided by those large companies, further entrenching these big firms. And if that sort of decreases the overall competitiveness of the entire AI ecosystem, that might actually hurt US national security. So just sort of open the floor to both of you on that question and what potential responses you have to that line of thinking.
Yeah, I'd love to take this one, just because I've been pretty involved in just the NAIR from the inception and the study of it. But there have been some criticisms of the NAIR, as the belief is that you just kind of noted, that it increases the power concentrations of tech. And the primary argument here is that the US government will at least initially need to rely on commercial cloud computing to get the NAIR off the launch pad. However, it's a bit more nuanced. In our report, we refer to this as the make or buy decision. And it represents a choice the US government has as to whether it subsidizes cloud computing credits to be used by researchers or whether it builds a series of on-prem HPC clusters. So if the federal government did indeed subsidize commercial cloud use, that would provide more government dollars towards industry. However, in our report, we recommended the federal government kind of split the difference here. And there's actually a legitimate policy reasons for this. And one reason why we call for this a hybrid model of an HPC cluster and usage of commercial cloud credits as well is well, first we note when an HPC system is at full continuous use, our research shows a cost savings of 7.5 times compared to the commercial cloud. So the cost savings alone makes it attractive. However, it will take time to build such a computing infrastructure and the time is of the essence here. And so therefore, we recommend the federal government subsidizes commercial cloud computing until such a fully built and operation computing system is available to researchers. Additionally, they may need to continue to purchase some credits over time, just as there's a possibility of any surge usage the computing infrastructure can handle. So that's, I think, what the argument is. And my rebuttal to critics is pretty straightforward. They haven't offered suitable alternatives, and frankly, have only proposed a continuation of the status quo, which has big tech as the leaders in AI and R&D and absorbing most of the talent pool. So, but by denying the public the same tools big tech enjoys, it only exacerbates the power concentration that they seek to curtail. So to me, it doesn't really make sense or add up, and I've never been able to try to get there. But I'm open-minded to learning more.
Yeah, I agree with Russell on all counts. I might just expand a little bit, reiterating some of the places where big tech has already cornered the market. So the talent is already flowing there, as he pointed out with his graphs, and it's not being developed elsewhere because people in academia and out in the open world are not building quite so much of the distributed architectures that are needed for these larger projects, or even just to use them or develop the tech. And then in addition to that, the algorithms are starting to be held close, which is a big change from where we used to be. And I think that this provides us an opportunity supporting academic research into larger computing is a way to upend that concern.
That's great. And maybe just following on this trend, we have a couple questions in the chat, and please do continue to type out your questions in the chat, and I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. We're already getting a lot of really good ones. I want to try to connect two questions we've gotten from Anupam and also Yonadav on the subject of sort of bigger and bigger models that we've been talking about, and sort of foundational models that both of you brought up in the talk, and Drew gave a really excellent overview of. So that I think what Anupam is referencing in terms of the pushback against these foundational models is potentially like a model of the Nair that is all about allowing access to foundational models, just supports that paradigm of larger and larger models being the future of AI development. And eventually that will crowd out smaller players. Maybe we will never get to a stage where, you know, academia is producing models like GPT-2 or GPT-3. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Anupam, on that line of question. And Yonadav is also asking a similar question, right? Sort of, should we be trying to maintain the parity of academia and big tech on this issue of like building bigger and bigger AI, or should we be trying to, you know, allow different paradigms of building AI be outside of these foundational models? So let me just turn it over to whoever wants to take a first crack on that.
I'm going to take the first crack because I'm not going to say much here. It's clearly much more of a question for Drew. But what I would say is it's really hard to figure out if there is a different pathway from large language models, large models, if no one else is doing the investigation to be able to figure out if there is a different pathway, because they don't have the resources or the tools to be able to do it, right? So if you're a commercial and commercial is only leaning towards that particular area, there's not going to be a different, who's going to find out these other possibilities when it's just the research is much more limited in this particular case.
Right. And I'll say that there are definitely other options. So we're not moving exclusively towards a foundations model approach of artificial intelligence. That's just one avenue that we might want to keep our eye on. I think that it's worth investing a little bit to open that world up to others. What I would also say, though, is that even the biggest foundations models are way beyond what a single processor can hold. And even smallish models, things that we would consider small by present days, often require multiple processors that put people in a difficult situation if they don't have these accesses.
Great. And yeah, just to clarify, Yonadav's question was about not necessarily suggesting a different paradigm, but that understanding these models better could use less compute than training them from scratch. And actually, that's a point people have been making about some of these large models, is there's not enough scrutiny of sort of the existing biases that are put in terms of how they're initially trained, all these different decisions that are made, sort of like this tacit knowledge in terms of how the model was trained in the first place. Let me get to
my comment on that. Sorry,
go for it.
That it's hard to do that scrutiny on the large scale models without building them if they're behind closed doors. And so opening up to academic research creates that opportunity. I think that a lot of the work doesn't require, so some of it does require building models, and some of that would be necessary. A lot of it requires just running the models, but we don't have access to the models to run them because they're held up in a company.
Let me get one question that's more directed towards you, Russell, but Drew, please feel free to chime in. Amy Chow asks about this trend of PhD students moving from academia to industry, and brings up these potential alternative factors like better salary, job benefits, market availability. How would you think about access to cloud computing and maybe being able to tackle grander challenges in context with these alternative factors when you're making this point?
Yeah, so in my presentation, I note that there are three main drivers as to why there's less PhDs staying in academia and going into industry. And of course, that is the access to compute and data. But the third part of it is also salary. So we're not naive to the salary aspect here. But even at Stanford, where we don't pay nearly as much as Google does, a few miles away, we're still able to retain some good talent here. The issue here is whether or not people will have access to be able to do this research in the first place. So there are a lot of good examples of where people do things, don't want to work for big tech or other organizations. And there are a lot of people who go into government, for example, and do government service. There are a lot of people who go into academia that know that they can make much more money in the private sector, probably for their talent and skills, than they do in academia that just will never pay nearly as much. So there are plenty of examples of people not going into these fields and making the choice to be able to teach the next generation. But if you don't have the resources or the tools to be able to do this, your only real option is to go into the large tech companies where they are doing some type of research in this space, and you do now have the resources. So I think it's just a resource constraint more than the salaries in this particular case. And there are enough examples, I think, to prove that. I do agree that it's much more attractive to work at some of these other places, given the financial benefits, but it's not a full, I think, argument that that's the prohibitive area. I think a better way of retention is giving people the resources.
Yeah, I second that. I'd add that a lot of this is about talent pipeline and people who are not yet competitive for those positions. I'm not anti-big tech. Some of this is like how do we support the flow, and then also building other opportunities, other economic opportunities. People who can play with these ideas more freely with a wider remit than is afforded at big tech can create other companies like what Russell alluded to in his presentation.
Great. Let me get to a question by David Haggerty, where he talks about the potential national security risks of having a centralized data in a sort of a NAIR platform, and potentially, I'm assuming he means maybe like cybersecurity risks or like maybe data poisoning, stuff like that. And I'll pile on a little bit to that question in terms of like sort of the examples that you're drawing from, potentially like Landsat or other like ways to make government data more open source. Those seem pretty easy to just like open source a data set, but maybe the infrastructure behind a NAIR might be harder. What other like potential implementation challenges do you think are going to be the biggest issue for the NAIR? And maybe, whoever wants to start, and then the other person can fill in.
So on that, in our report, we actually comprehensively studied this. So we have chapters dedicated to cybersecurity specifically and how to be best compliant from a cybersecurity perspective. There's also where we talk about the access model, who can get on to the NAIR itself. And that's a really key important aspect to this. And I won't go too long into that, but there are also tiers for certain levels of data. So let's say, for example, the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has data available where someone could work on the purpose for modeling hurricanes to be able to see when they are more likely to hit and use that as a statistical to be able to do the research in this particular case. That's pretty innocuous data that we wouldn't be worried about, right? But as you start to get into higher level tiers of data that have a greater degree of sensitivity, there will require increases in security and security aspects to be able to just access it. And that's from an access perspective. And as I noted, the cybersecurity aspects of this are pretty well outlined in our report. Yeah, putting everything into one specific area for the convenience of researchers to use can make it it's quite a big pot that someone would want to get into. But the truth of the matter is I don't know if some of this other data is much more secure in its current locations as is.
Right. I would say that a lot of the focus within the task force is about figuring out which data can go up there and which can't. Not everything needs to go up there. Certainly no classified data needs to be openly available or even attached. In terms of implementation, there was a recommendation in somebody else's response, I believe it was InQtel's, that the data, that this should be a data environment and not just a database. And I think that I like that. It's people can go in, add data, change it up, show what their like branch data sets, combine data sets, post other ones, show what their benchmarks are, and it can be like a living resource for data.
Yeah, that's great. And actually this is related to sort of this discussion about something beyond just the cloud, beyond just like a data set, data environment. I want to get to John Garofalo's question. And I think, Drew, you touched on in your presentation, sort of, it's not just about compute, it's also about algorithms. And John asks, what is the role and need for open environments, frameworks, tools, standards, in your perspective of the challenge you've spoken to? And how would you, think about the need to support open research that extends beyond data and cloud computing? And actually, I've been thinking about this strand too. I read a paper by Daniel Rock yesterday where he uses the shock of open sourcing TensorFlow as something that created this sort of like value across all these different actors that I think we're trying to do with this NAIR recommendation. So maybe I'll start with you, Drew, and Russ, so please join in after.
Right, and this was the kind of the point that I was trying to push with my whole presentation, is that for a couple of reasons, partly because of the amount of money that's being invested in these systems to develop them, partly because of the difficulty of using them, we've started to move away from that open sharing model. Some of these places that might have previously provided their tools and their algorithms and their developments freely now just say that they exist or don't even, and hold them privately. I think that this NAIR, that should be one of its main goals, is to try to revive and continue that open sharing model that's been so useful for us.
Great. Let me also, let's switch gears a little bit, because this question by Chris Mings, he asks, is there any concern for open availability leading to an easier pathway to nefarious uses? And that might allow us to talk about, is there a role for this NAIR to also regulate access to some of these models? So yeah, whoever wants to take a stab at Chris's question can go ahead.
Sure. So I have another report that came out last year about security of the supply chain of AI in general. And the data sets can be poisoned, the models can be manipulated either in their training or during their downloads. And this is a real problem that needs to be paid attention to. What I would say in some of the recommendations that I have are to understand which models and algorithms and data are important and protect those to the degree that you can. But then also it would be great to have a resource where those to have those resources provided in a way where there's like an accountability that says, we know this resource was built by trusted folk and has been hashed in a way that we know that it hasn't been manipulated since 2018 or something like this. And so not all of the data might fall into that, but being able to track where these resources came from and have some sort of certificate that says that indicates their level of trust. This is completely untrusted, could be made by anybody. This is partially trusted to a level 3. Coming up with a level like that or a scaling system and providing traceability, I think could be an opportunity for the NAIR, for both the models, the data sets, even the programming libraries potentially.
Great. Let me get to a question that might bring in Russell and some of his presentation in terms of, we have a question from Chris Terry about how the US model compares to the Chinese model, and are US tech companies hindering the US being able to compete with China? Does this mean that China is gaining competitive advantage through state-sponsored AI? And sort of maybe you could also touch on how the NAIR might perpetuate an AI arms race between the US and China. So let me start with you on that question.
Sure. On the AI arms race and how the competition in AI, some people have these valid concerns that get raised vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis AI, China and the US. I would certainly hope no one wants to see a Cold War between China and the US. And I don't believe the security dilemma between these two nations is a foregone conclusion. But when a country is increasing its nuclear weapons stockpile, testing sophisticated hypersonic missiles, militarizing islands in the sea, and claims AI is what will help them achieve hegemony, you better believe them. So the issue is, while some fear the United States' pursuit of leadership in AI could lead to a Cold War, what happens when on the other side of that equation, your counterpart is preparing for a Cold War and you are not? So I think that should just put some, people who have reservations on that should be very thoughtful in the idea that it may not be the US that's trying to achieve this. There might be the counterpart here where we can de-escalate. It's really important. I want to say one other thing too on the two systems. So right now you have two countries that are primary leaders in AI innovation, China and the US. Both countries are applying the use of the technology quite differently. In the US, a robust debate is happening right now about whether we should even allow for the police use of facial recognition technology, for example. Advocacy groups are pressuring government to be stewards of better stewards of the technology, so much so that the White House Office of Technology Policy recently requested information from the public for an AI Bill of Rights. So conversely, in China, the regime is using the technology to cement power in the form of digital authoritarianism. So this is pretty evident with the surveillance of and the human rights abuses of the Uyghur population. So you're kind of seeing two systems here. And while albeit the US is not perfect in its system, in their particular system, the question is who will set the norms and who of these two countries in this. And so if you're not a leader in AI innovation, I fear if the US falls behind in this space, the use of AI may not be a positive use for humanity. So I think those are really two distinct distinctions. Now, the original question was much more to the industry side of this. On the industry side of this, you're starting to see, I think, both countries apply a much more regulatory regime towards their private industry in the application of this. I was kind of more just referring to the actual government's use of the AI here in this particular example, though.
I might add just a little bit, is that it seems there's some early indications that the Chinese crackdown on their own companies is driving people back into academia. And some of the graphs that I've seen about where this talent is being, where these difficult projects are being run, look like they might be being done more in academia in China than they're being done here. And so I worry a little bit about our relative talent pipelines. And I think that this national security dilemma that we're fretting over is going to be it's going to be one in the economic space rather than the military space, both I hope, but also I think. And so the talent pipeline is in my view the key factor. So anything we can do to make our talent pipeline more stable and fast moving, I think is a win from a national security perspective.
Great. Yeah, fascinating discussion so far. Please keep putting your questions in the chat. Apologize to any that I've missed so far. Let's go in a slightly different direction in terms of going back to this specific policy proposal of the NAIR. We have a question from Benjamin Larson asking, what could alternatives to NAIR look like? And he gives the example of potentially new forms of public-private partnerships that could open up data, compute, and resources in ways that are different from the NAIR. And have you all given any considerations to that alternative model?
Yeah, so before we started our research project, a core group of us started just talking about this. And one of my colleagues brought up a really good point and said, if this is just about a compute issue, why doesn't the federal government just subsidize cloud credits and call it a day instead of having this task force and all of these things that need to be done? And the problem with that is it does get down to the data. And so one part you're talking about, you just provided an engine, but you've given no gasoline for that engine. So it's quite difficult to find ways, and we thought about this, where you would be able to provide a certain different model that wasn't as expansive as the NAIR. And the reality is that we started to investigate further. It was just, this is a much more optimal pathway forward. The NAIR itself could be a public-private partnership, and the task force may come back with that recommendation. And in fact, part of us, we do say in this, is there needs to be some degree of there needs to be some degree of civil society and private society, the private sector involved. And one reason for that is, for example, the approval of, we call for an ethics approval in some of these, or an ethics review if it's warranted. And the problem with that is you don't want the federal government being the arbiters of what is an appropriate ethics review. That should be coming from the private sectors and civil society, not the federal government making that decision. So in the larger aspects of all this, you do want partnerships with organizations, and I encourage people to read our report to be able to see where we get a little bit further on that.
Great. One more thing on sort of going back to some of these geopolitical concerns, and sort of, we've talked a little bit about the benefits of openness. Rani Kinoshita is pushing on some of the risks of openness and specifically asks, in regards to the AI arms race, can you speak to some of the national security implications with respect to the NAIR being open? How, Russell, you just talked about a little bit about private companies maybe regulating it, but Ronnie is asking a little bit more about how would we regulate who is using it and for what purposes, more from the perspective of potential like leakage where the NAIR is not just benefiting the US, but might actually be benefiting other countries. So whoever wants to take the first crack at that one, please go ahead.
I can do a quick one. I suspect Russell's got deeper thoughts on this. The NAIR will definitely require some degree of monitoring and access control. And like another concern that I think about is misuse of people using this not for AI and exploration, but for economic gain, either running a company on it or running crypto miners or something like that. And so you have to be careful with accesses. You have to do monitoring, and I suspect that there will be some slippage. But if that slippage can be maintained to a small percentage, even if it was 10%, it would still be a 90% win for the US. I don't think that you would get anywhere near 10% slippage. But even if it was, I think that you would still benefit by moving forward.
I'm not going to spend too much, just in case we can get a few more questions, and I think Drew answered that well, but I just want to clarify. I'm not saying that the private industry should be regulating the NAIR, so I want to make sure that that is not out there. What I'm saying is that there are the possibility of having something like a board that was made up of people from civil society and the private sector is what I'm referring to in that particular case.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that clarification. I also have a question from Dakota Carey. He is asking, how can the US shape its system to build and leverage international alliances? And I think maybe I'll start with Russell on that question.
Sure. So I think the NAIR in itself will be useful just because you'll have a much more robust workforce and well-trained, innovative base within the US. So I think that's a useful thing, but I'm not actually, at this point, wouldn't recommend the commingling of the NAIR at the international level. There's just too many complexities that come from this. Maybe in the future, that could be something that could come. But another provision that was in the NSCAI final report, which I think could be quite useful, is a multilateral AI Research Institute, AMARI or AMARI, however you want to call it. And I think that actually stands a lot of potential collaboration at the international level and can be a place where we can set norms in this space between like-minded countries.
Let me go with another potential risk or associated with the NAIR. Jim Burke asks, do you believe energy and sustainability concerns will affect this plan? And I think there's been a lot of conversation about potentially the environmental costs of large-scale compute. So have either of you thought about sort of how to address this particular sustainability issue?
So I sure worry about that because I think, and that's probably my greatest worry of the NAIR and the biggest negative that I see. I think the positives outweigh the negatives, but I do have this concern that this large scale computing emits lots of carbon, and at a time when we don't need that. And so the question is do we have a few companies that right now that are engaged in this? And if we make people throughout the United States, across the country, actively using a system like this, are we creating thousands of carbon polluters in addition to that? So it's a valid concern. And maybe Drew can speak to it further than I can, but there are types of computing now that are trying to reduce the level of carbon emission in this particular case.
Yeah, I agree that it's definitely a concern and should be monitored. The chipset and processors have gotten efficient, and these data centers are trying to do better about using renewable energies to counteract the problem, but that's an effort to counteract a real problem that needs to be thought about.
Great. Maybe we can end with one last question from Rail Baird, and it touches on some of the themes we talked about before. And Rail asks, should the NAIR be accessible to the international community? And sort of how might access differ for different types of users when you're thinking about sort of access to the NAIR? And I might just add on to that question too, is sort of we focus a lot about academia. Could we also think about access eventually for small, medium enterprises who might not have access to these large sources of compute? So yeah, start with Rail's question about how might we broaden access for NAIR either in the short term or maybe in the future?
Since I know we're at the end, I'll be real quick, but I'm less sanguine about that. At the international level, if you had asked me about a year and a half ago before we started working on the study of the report, I would have said, sure, sounds great. But when we actually got into the weeds and started looking at the difficulty of the data aspects here, because we're talking about government data and the current legal privacy issues, right down to the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which affects the IP issues that come from this. There's cultural aspects with data. I think it would be much too difficult right now for that to be feasible. What was the second question again? Sorry.
I just piled on a little asking about access for small and medium firms.
And to that end, it's again, same type of major hurdles to be able to get through if you are to make that available for the private sector. And what we recommend essentially in our report is essentially piloting this at the academic level. And if it looks possible, then maybe you could consider that. But right now, I'm personally not favorable towards that.
Yeah, our recommendations in our much smaller response were similar. I would love to see it expand both to internationally to partners, but even domestically outside of academia, because I would like to be able to give a broader representation. Getting into academia, even as an undergrad, is a feat. And I would like people to be able to explore and play the way that they can today or over the last few years without having to clear that hurdle first. And I also think that could be a driver for economic progress. Like maybe we can't fund a small or medium-sized business, but maybe we can fund the person who's exploring and turns into a medium-sized business once they found their new discoveries.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really great discussion. And thank you to CSET's External Affairs team for running the webinar, and I'll turn it over to Lynn. Thank you to both of our speakers for a really excellent conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Drew Lohn and Russell Wald, and our moderator, Jeff Ding. Thanks too to everyone for joining us today and for your thought-provoking questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to them all. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to csat.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and our research updates. We'll share more information about our next webinar in the coming days. In the meantime, please stay safe, and we hope to see you again, if only virtually, real soon.